before we get going, if you enjoy what we do on Spectator TV, then do subscribe to our YouTube channel. You do this by clicking the button at the bottom of the video and then tapping the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode ever again. And why not subscribe to the Spectator magazine too while you're at it? Get 12 weeks of the magazine for just £12 and we'll give you a free £20 Amazon voucher, completely free. Do the maths there. And that's 3 months of The Spectator delivered to your door and available online for just £12. Did we mention the voucher? Just go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer to take it up. Now first, Priti Patel has introduced the Nationality and Borders Bill, which could see refugees illegally coming into the UK jailed and border officers given powers to use force to keep illegal immigrants away. Is this the right approach? And if it is it enough? I'm joined now by Douglas Murray, who is in this week's cover piece, saying more needs to be done, and Enver Solomon, CEO of the Refugee Council. Douglas, Enver, thanks for coming on the show today. Douglas, to begin, in your cover piece, you note that the number of migrants has reached record levels. Can you talk us through why?
Yes, of course. Everyone will be aware that this story has been developing in recent years. We have seen across Europe in the last decade an increase in illegal crossings principally from Turkey and from North Africa into Mediterranean Europe. And we've seen a trickle in recent years of a similar movement across the English Channel from France to usually Dover or around the Dover area in the south of England. And this movement has been a political issue of a kind for some time. Viewers will remember that in 2018, the then Home Secretary Sajid Javid cut short his holiday to go and stare at the English Channel and say that he was getting a grip on this issue. This issue, however, hasn't gone away, however much politicians stare at water, and we've seen a very significant increase in the number of people coming illegally in recent months. And it's important to get the figures in some perspective. The number of migrants arriving was 4 times higher last year than it was the year before. That it was almost 2,000 people in 2019, and it was 8,500 in 2020. Now the number for 2021, having quadrupled last year, the number for 2021 is already double that of last year. We've already seen in the first 6 months of this year more than 9,000 migrants arriving illegally by boat across the English Channel, and we've also seen the daily records for that exceeded, with a high in July of 430 people making the journey in just one day. So this has become an issue which politicians continue to pretend that they're going to address and continue to not address. And as I say in the piece, if they don't, then the numbers will simply grow and grow, because the pool of people who wish to come to the UK and who might be attracted by this idea of a parallel asylum system, where on the one hand there's the legal system, on the other hand there's the first across the channel in a dinghy competition, the number of people willing to do that is vast across many continents in the globe. And so I suggest it's a massive issue that the government needs to get a grip on. If it doesn't, it'll grow and grow and become worse for the government.
Enver, do you think it's an issue that more people are trying and succeeding in terms of crossing the channel?
Well, it's important to put this in context. There are far fewer people coming to this country seeking asylum than there were a decade ago. We had a huge, far higher number, over 100,000 at one point when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. Last year, the numbers were down to around about 30,000. And if you look at the trend over the last 5 years, and as I say, over the last decade, it's a downward trend. Nevertheless, the numbers, as Douglas rightly says, coming across the channel have increased. And that, of course, poses a big challenge for our government, and it would do for any government of any colour, because when you have people coming across one of the world's busiest shipping lanes in very small boats, risking their lives, that is a huge issue, and it has to be addressed. But the context is really important here. The overall context is that the numbers coming to this country seeking asylum over the last few years and over the last decade has been declining, and it's important to recognise that.
Several things about that. One is, of course, it's not surprising that asylum claims were down last year because most of the world was in lockdown, and it's very hard to draw the trajectory of the last decade, not least also because the movement you're talking about, of course, in the previous decade under Labour was significantly to do with intra-EU migration. It was to do with the British government losing control of Britain's borders, in part because of our membership of the EU. One of the things that caused the British public to vote to leave the EU in 2016 was the idea that the British government would be more capable of controlling the British borders after leaving the EU than it was before. So that's why it's a particular political problem for this government. Movement and migration ebbs and flows. But if after a government has been mandated by the public with tidying up its asylum and immigration system, and in fact is seen to be losing control of it in such a visible way, then I think this is a problem. And just one other point on this, which is that it's important, of course, to bear in mind that this whole issue of the signal that you give out as a country. The people who are trying to cross the channel illegally at the moment have gone through multiple safe countries before doing so. They do not have to come to Britain. They are choosing to come to Britain. They do not have to pay the smuggling gangs thousands of pounds to go across the channel. They are choosing to do that and choosing to leave safe EU countries. And if the government in the UK encourages that movement, then, as I say, the number of people who will like to follow is limitless. Because we are talking here not just about people who are fleeing, for instance, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, but, as we saw recently in a surge of arrivals the other week, people from Vietnam, for instance. There are people from sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, across the world, people who are suffering economic deprivation, who would like to come to the UK, and who the UK cannot allow to come.
But just on that, Douglas, as he just put across there, but also in his cover piece, talks about the fact that the current arrangement privileges those who can afford entry, can afford to make that journey, and also encourages people smugglers. Do you agree with that?
Look, I think it's really important here to understand the context. Even when we had inward migration from the EU, the main countries of those nationalities coming here seeking asylum were not from the European Union. That was a separate migration challenge. This is an issue which goes back right to when this country, and we're talking about it on a very significant day, 7 decades since this country, along with other countries, put its name to the UN Convention on Refugees. And Conservative Prime Ministers since Churchill, all the way up to David Cameron, have stuck to a very important principle. And that principle is that those people who come to this country claiming that they need protection should be given a fair hearing on UK soil. And if they need protection, they should be given it. And if they don't need protection, they should be sent back. And indeed, today, in the front line, in the fight against COVID, if you look at people working in the NHS, there are Afghan doctors who had no choice but to get here in the back of a lorry. There are people who came from Iran fleeing oppression, who are top-level surgeons. And indeed, if you look across the arts, if you look across education, if you look across business, there are many refugees who are making an incredible contribution to this country, proud to be Britons, playing by the rules, paying their taxes and contributing to this country in an incredible way. And it's very important that as a nation, we continue 7 decades after the UN Convention to stick to that key principle that, as I say, many Conservative Prime Ministers have continued to stick to, which is if you come here with a case for refugee protection, you are given a fair hearing.
There are 2 important things to say about that. The first is just to address the fiction that the arrivals coming over by boat from France are all going to end up being surgeons, doctors, leading academics and statisticians and much more. And it's not the case. It's the fantasy of the pro-open borders lobby that everyone
Charles,
who
can I
arrives
just say, sorry to interrupt, but I'm not advocating pro-borders. What I'm simply advocating, if you let me finish, please, Charles, come on, you've had a lot to say. What I'm advocating is the UN Convention on Refugees. Now, the UN Convention on Refugees, just let me finish, please let me make my point. I'm not interrupting you. The UN Convention on Refugees is very clear, and it upholds the principle that if you are fleeing oppression, war, terror, and you come to this country, you can make a claim for protection. And indeed, we have done that for decades. There are many people across this country who have come from Afghanistan. Indeed, we brought together refugees earlier this week across 7 decades, people that had fled Idi Amin in Uganda, people that had fled Hungary and the communist totalitarian regime. All individuals that came here made a claim for protection under the UN Convention and were given protection. What I'm advocating is that we adhere to that. By no means am I advocating open borders, because if people don't have a legitimate claim for protection or a need for protection, absolutely they should be sent back to the country from which they have come from, and they should be supported to do that.
I'm very glad to hear you say that, but yet you're encouraging the breaking of the law and the breaking of the asylum procedures by advocating, or indeed encouraging, the illegal movement of people across the channel. And as I say, we have an asylum system. I think
the UN Convention is not breaking the law.
Please, you said a moment ago that you hadn't interrupted me, and you just have again. It's extremely deleterious for our country to be in a situation where we encourage the breaking of the law by migrants who you then pretend afterwards are going to never break the law again and are all going to become doctors and surgeons. But let's just address the bigger issue, which is a fundamental one, which is that you know as well as I do that UN Convention for the UK is a polite fiction. It relies on of it not being the case that very many people are going to make it to the UK and then claim asylum. The people you talked about who come from, for instance, Afghanistan have, as I say, walked across multiple safe countries. They are looking at Europe as a buffet that they choose from, not as a haven to try to reach. And it is exceptionally important that we as a country understand this in the modern context. You keep talking about context. Let's address the context. The context we are in now is very different from that 7 decades ago. We have not just the ability to see how the rest of the world is living through our smartphones and much more, and people across Africa have these devices, but we can go and move around much more easily than at any time previously. In the current era, there are people from across the Middle East, the Far East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, all wishing to move to Europe, and Britain is one of the countries they would like to come to. 1/3 of people in Sub-Saharan Africa polled by Gallup last year said they would like to move. They do not want to move to the Middle East, they want to move to Europe, they want to move northwards. Now, my suggestion is that in that context, Britain has to be realistic about what our capabilities are of providing a haven for the world's poor, dispossessed, and much more. I think we are a small country. We should have small ambitions about this. We cannot be the haven for anyone in the world who wishes to have a better life to come in and try to make that better life here. It's impossible, but as I say, we've been running on the polite fiction of recent decades, and I'd like us not to keep up that fiction.
Enver, just on that, do you think the current situation is sustainable? If we look at the current numbers, is that a situation that can go on?
Well, the numbers are down, but, I'm not interested in arguing about numbers. I'm interested in us as a nation approaching this with compassion and committing to what I think has always been a great British value that, as I say, many Conservative Prime Ministers have been proud to adhere to, which is that if people come here with the need and a claim for protection, that should be looked at. And if they have a need that meets the threshold, they should be given protection. And we have done that for 7 decades, as I say. If you go around this country, it was really fascinating, Katie. I actually did an interview about this on Sky News this morning. And the presenter himself said to me, look, my family came here fleeing a totalitarian regime in Europe and were given protection here under the convention. And that says to me that his family and his background is not an isolated case. There's many, many people that will be watching this that will have connections through their families to individuals who have come here and have been given protection if they need protection. And that's something that we should be proud of as a nation, to be compassionate and to give people that opportunity to have safety and protection here. And we should continue to do that.
And Douglas, in your piece, you talk about the need for a tougher response in terms of the government's response. What do you think they should be considering?
A whole range of proposals. The first is they could follow the example the Greeks have set in the last couple of years and simply turn around the boats in the Channel. That'd be much preferable to the British Coast Guard effectively acting as a wing of the smuggling operation by picking people up a few miles into the Channel and then ferrying them to the UK. They could try to follow the Australian precedent and offshore people wishing to come, make sure that their applications are processed elsewhere than on British soil, because as Enver knows, in actual fact, once you're in, it's extremely hard for the British government to repatriate. It's all sorts of reasons why they don't do it and why it ends up not happening and being kicked down the road. And another option is to follow our colleagues and friends in Denmark, who have managed to introduce numerous restrictions in recent years to ensure that migration into Denmark has gone down by something like 9 times in the last few years. Australia, Greece, Denmark, these are all also very distinguished liberal democracies. They all have a fine liberal tradition, and they've also realised that they can hold on to the principle of legality and of borders, and that they can do so without anyone but a very relatively small fringe of people claiming that they are some kind of beyond-the-pale countries.
Enver, which of those options do you think has merit?
Well, I think this is a global issue, very much in the way that climate change is a global issue. And of course, it's a challenge for every Western government when you have people who are being displaced on the scale that we do have globally today. Millions and millions of people being displaced through no fault of their own. And indeed, if there was displacement in Europe and Europeans were being subject to what is happening in other continents, I think Europeans would expect the rest of the world to respond in a compassionate way too. So globally, we have to think about how we address this huge challenge. And the challenge will continue, no doubt, going forward into the future years, into the future decades. And it requires Western governments to come together in the way that they're doing over climate change and to think about a solution that reflects the principles that nations have abided by and stuck to and supported since the horrors of the Second World War. Principles that are about humanity, that are about recognising that we are a global community and we respond appropriately to support fellow humans when they're in crisis and when they're in need of support. And they need to come together and form a multilateral agreement to respond to that right across Europe, because it's a challenge, as Douglas says, for European nations. But that response needs to be based on principles, as I say, of humanity and compassion, principles that many, many nations, many of those liberal democracies that Douglas refers to, are very proud to sign up to. And that's what needs to drive the response to this crisis, in the same way that governments are coming together to use a set of principles in response to the climate crisis.
I agree that this is a global crisis, but I think that people talking about Britain's borders very rarely have any idea of the global scale of it. When people talk about the need for compassion and humanity, I don't think anyone is anti-compassion or anti-humanity. I think these are very easy ways to browbeat people into accepting the breaking of the laws of the country that they're in. It is not a British tradition or anything of which Britain needs to be proud to pretend that Britain is not Britain unless we allow the breaking of the law in our asylum and immigration policies. The fact that historically Britain has on occasion been able to give sanctuary to really very significantly small numbers of people in our history is a reflection that we're a small island with relatively small resources in the global scheme of things. And when people say that we need to come together to answer this, I agree with this. Britain, however, cannot be the resort of choice for anybody in the world. As I say, we had the example of people coming from Vietnam again the other day across the channel. For anyone across the Far East, the Middle East, the Near East, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and everywhere else in the world where they are not having the life they would like. Some people are fleeing war zones, absolutely. The majority are fleeing economic deprivation. And it is a very negative idea indeed, to my mind, to pretend and to console our consciences by pretending in any way that Britain can answer all of these problems. We cannot. What we can do is make things an awful lot worse in Britain and in France and in neighbouring EU countries by adhering to a polite lie that it is remotely in Britain's gifts to solve all of the problems that exist in the world. And as I say, in particular by pretending that as well as the legal asylum system we should also have a parallel asylum system, an illegal one, where whoever gets across the channel first in a boat wins entry into Britain. I think it's a great mistake, and the people who have been encouraging it will rue the day when this gets more out of control down the line. It is something that will need to be addressed, and if it isn't, we've seen in the last decade what happens. I've heard all of the arguments about compassion and humanity made by compassionate and pseudo-humanitarian figures across Scandinavia, Mediterranean Europe. They all said in the last 10 years, let them come, let us answer the woes of the world, and then it got way out of hand and they had to crack down and snap back. Of course they did, because surprise, surprise, it's not in Denmark's gift to sort out the world's woes. It's not in Sweden's gift, not in Italy's gift, and it's not in Britain's either.
It's in the world's gift to respond to global challenges in the way that we're responding to the climate challenge. And of course, it's in the world's gifts and the gift of democratic nations to respond to this challenge. And I'm not suggesting that Britain opens its borders. I'm simply suggesting that as a nation, we uphold a principle that we have stuck to for 7 decades, which is giving protection to those who need it. Those that come across the channel are not all economic migrants. Some of them will be, but if you look at the main nations that they're coming from Syria, they're coming from Eritrea, where there's a huge issue with refugee camps due to the war in Ethiopia and the civil struggle in Ethiopia. They're coming from Iraq, we know the situation in Iraq, and they're coming from a highly oppressive regime in Iran. We need to give them the opportunity to have their case heard, and if they merit protection, we should give them protection in the way that we have done for many, many decades. And the communities that have settled in this nation as a consequence of our commitment to refugee protection have made a huge contribution to this nation. Indeed, if you look at parliaments, you could track back through many parliamentarians' lives and families those refugees that have come here. Indeed, our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, is one example of that.
On that, Enver,
just one very quick point. There's a massive fallacy on this, which is that because you have some benefits from some migrants through migration, that an answer is the more people come, the more benefits will accrue. And it's simply not the case. None of the data bears that out, because as well as the good news stories that Enver has just described, there are also very many bad news stories. And for every one person who contributes to the economy by becoming a surgeon, many others will be going into the black market, will be living very unhappy lives in Britain on the margins of society that they have entered into by first of all consorting with smuggling gangs and then entering the black economy. And I just am fed up of having spent years hearing people pretending that if you make it to a country like Britain, you will end up inevitably in the position of surgeon or academic. It's a terrible falsehood built upon an existing falsehood, which, as I say, is our asylum aims of recent decades.
And just finally on that, I mean, in your work, you offer support to those coming to the country. What do you think is the case when reality meets what people have expected in advance?
I mean, the reality is all those people we work with, when they come here, whether that's through so-called regular routes or the irregular routes that Charles is seems to be so angry about.
You'll find, first of all, it's Douglas.
Sorry, Douglas.
And secondly, that it's not an irregular route.
Just let me finish. The irregular routes.
God, I just wanted you to get my name right first.
Sorry, I do apologise. That was my oversight. It wasn't an intended mistake. Sorry, Douglas. Those irregular routes that people come here to, whether that's from Afghanistan or other countries, what we find is when they arrive here, they are hugely grateful for the support that this country is offering them, and they want to make a contribution. They want to do right by this country, and they simply want to rebuild their lives. They want to do the best for themselves and for their families, and they know that doing the best for themselves is by working hard and by making a contribution. And I think what stands out from research by ONS and by other reputable research agencies is that communities that have come and settled in this country are often the communities who are extremely hardworking, who do play by the rules and who do pay their taxes and are upstanding citizens who want to contribute to this community, to their communities. And we need to recognise that. You know, I don't want to have an argument about what is true and untrue. I want to have an argument about the reality based on our work. And, you know, I'm sat here from Leeds today. We're welcoming a family that's coming in from Lebanon, from a refugee camp today. They will arrive, they will be taken to a home in York, supported by the council. And I'm certain that that family will go on to make an active contribution to their community. I was reading the other day about the woman who leaves and has set up the Conservative Supporters and Friends of Afghanistan. She came over here with her father in a refrigerator. Their only choice was to come on a so-called irregular route, what Douglas calls illegal routes. They came here and now they're making a huge contribution to this country. And it's important to reflect the reality of those stories in this conversation.
Sure. Well, Enver, you said you didn't want to talk about facts or what was true and what wasn't true. You said you wanted to talk about your work. But let me introduce a fact to it, which is that what you've just said, again, is incorrect. A study from University College London 10 years ago showed that over the previous 2 decades, the amount of money that migrants took out of the state in benefits was hundreds of millions of pounds less than what they paid in taxes. Sorry, hundreds of £1 million more than what they paid in taxation. It takes years for a migrant into the UK to pay back in taxation what they take out in benefits. It's very basic economics, this. The University College London study proved this. It doesn't even require a study from a university. It simply requires any observation of the facts. That the moment that you come into the UK and start using UK facilities and UK services, you are taking money out of the UK taxpayer's pot. And you may pay some of that back in. You may, in rare cases, pay all of it in. But the idea that migrants, particularly illegal migrants, arrive in the UK and become a net benefit to the UK is a fallacy. The benefits of migration of this kind, financially, accrue solely to the migrant and the family of the migrant. They do not come to the UK. So again, we could agree that the UK should be a destination for anyone in the world who wants to make their lives better. I don't think that would be desirable. But at the very least, even if that was the case that was being made, we shouldn't build a polite fiction on a polite fiction and pretend that people who arrive become a net economic benefit to the UK, because the figures don't bear that out.
Distinctly, I'm not talking about all migrants. I'm talking about those that have been given refugee status under our laws and under the convention which we have decided to adhere to over the last 7 decades. Those who are given refugee status make a phenomenal contribution to this country. I'm not talking about all migration. I'm talking about those that get refugee status, and that is that is a specific group of individuals who are given status. They're given indefinite leave to remain for 5 years, and then they go on to be given status here.
But what is the net economic benefit to Britain? I can understand why it's in their interest, but why is it in Britain's interest?
Why is it in Britain's
Financially.
interest to allow those that are fleeing war and oppression to come
No.
here
I said financially,
to rebuild their
we
lives?
could discuss the ethical issue all day, and I think we might disagree on it because I don't think we can give.
Well, I
asked you what the evidence is of the economic benefits of migrants who enter the UK illegally contributing to the UK economy.
I'm not talking about migrants who enter the UK illegally. You're talking at cross purposes to me, Douglas. I'm talking about individuals who come here, who make a claim for refugee protection and get refugee status. And are here,
so what is the economic benefit to the UK there?
And are here as individuals with legal, legitimate rights to be here.
And in that group, what is the net economic benefit to the UK?
They make a huge benefit to the UK.
What is it?
Through a whole range.
What figures?
I don't have the data to hand. The data that you were referring to was about all migration. I'm not talking about all migration. You're having a conversation with me about at cross purposes. Indeed, if you talk...
I don't think we are.
I think we are, because we're talking about individuals who get status that is regularised, where they're here legally as individuals with legal entitlements and legal rights.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the University College London report I just cited was not talking about the black economy because nobody can measure the black economy.
It was talking
about migrants in totality in the previous decades. Now, I'm
not talking about migrants over the totality.
No, I know you're not, Enver.
And it's an important
What I'm
distinction.
trying to get you to pin down, I know you said you don't want to debate the facts. What I'm trying to pin you down on is whether you have a fact about this, because if what you're contending is true, it means that of the migrants who arrive in the UK, a vast majority take out more in benefits than they put in taxation, except for people who have come to the UK seeking asylum and have been given asylum. It would mean that, as it were, these were the super migrants who provided such an exceptional level of contribution back to the UK economy that they made up, among others, for those who had entered without an asylum application. There is no data to back this up. It would be highly surprising if it was the case, but it is one of the reasons why this debate is so woeful, because it is very possible to talk about this purely in moral terms. It is desirable to talk about it in moral terms, but it's also necessary, if you're going to introduce finances to it and the contributions that people make, to also talk about the fact, as I say, that many, if not most, of the people arriving and making a claim will not become a scholar, will not become a doctor, will not become an eye surgeon. They will be entering at a low scale in the economy. They will be taking out more in benefits than they put back in taxation. And we should at least look at that full picture instead of engaging in the pretense that everybody who comes is going to be an amazing, overwhelming benefit to the UK economy and to UK society. It's part of the fiction built upon fiction, which I deeply object to in this discussion.
But just to bring this conversation to an end, because we do have to wrap up now, in response to Douglas, is your view that actually when we're having this conversation about the positive impact refugees bring to the country, that's something that cannot be answered just by economics?
I think economics is one element. There's the richness of that they bring as different cultures to communities. That's very much part of British life. You know, if you look at the representation in our national sporting teams, for example, reflects the richness, the different communities that have contributed and come and settled in this country. If you look at the facts around our food culture, around our culture, around the arts, you know, huge rich contributions as a consequence of people that have come here seeking protection and settled in communities across the country. I actually, dispute that refugees don't make a net economic contribution. Just because I don't have the stats to hand, I don't think that's necessarily not the case. From our experience at the Refugee Council, having worked, we came into existence 7 decades ago, and we've worked with many individuals that have come here seeking protection and then got refugee status. Largely, in our experience, overwhelmingly, they go on and contribute to communities. They're not a drain on the nation's resources. And their children go on and contribute. And it's important to remember that, the people that came here, those that I was talking about that we brought together earlier this week to reflect 7 decades since the UN Convention. They've had children, their children have had children, and they've all contributed in huge and diverse different ways to this country. So I think it's important to reflect that the contribution is on a multiple number of layers. And the reality is that as a nation, the fact that we have given so many people refugee protection, I think, makes us a richer nation and makes us a nation that has greater value and greater depth across the land in a multiplicity of ways.
Could I just ask very quick, I know we have to finish, but could I ask Enver, is there anyone who comes illegally or otherwise who doesn't contribute?
I don't
Whose
understand.
presence makes it worse?
What's your question about illegally or otherwise?
Illegally or otherwise, is there anyone who arrives in Britain you think who doesn't contribute to the country? Who doesn't make it richer economically, who doesn't make it richer culturally, who doesn't make it more interesting?
So I think if you look at the Syrian resettlement programme that David Cameron championed and brought in, there's no doubt that some of the Syrians that came here were from very poor, low-skilled communities. But our evidence of working, and we're one of the agencies that has resettled people from Syria, from the horrors of what's happened in Syria, our experience of working with them is that they've been extremely dedicated, extremely committed, wanted to get jobs, wanted to acquire the skills to contribute and not become a drain on the nation's resources.
So it's that everybody contributes in your view?
It's that tenacity and dedication and commitment that ultimately results in them contributing more than they take out.
So the point is...
There will, of course, amongst any cohort, there will, of course, be some who don't manage to do that. That's the same, you could take a school of children and you could look at, how many of those children might end up, in the criminal justice system being a net drain on resources or, living on benefits for a considerable part of their life. So in the same way, in that cohort, you'll have the same in this cohort. But in general,
but you think in general that it is that it is at the very least at the level of the British public as a whole, and most likely most people come make a contribution. That's clearly what you think. And in that case, the more the merrier. The more people that can come into the UK, the better. If that's your position, it's not mine, and it's not the position of the British public, who do not believe that the country has a more than merrier situation.
I'm not arguing for an open borders policy, and actually the views of the British public.
Close because the
views of the British public.
There's anything negative that comes from migration.
I'm not talking about overall migration, Douglas. This is where you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. I'm talking about the principle of refugee protection, which is not migration. It's a principle set down in the UN Convention that we give protection to those who need protection. That's what I'm talking about.
But I'm trying to get you to recognise that even among illegal asylum...
If you look at Poland, and polling was recently done by ICM for British Future, the majority of people polled felt that it was important to continue to adhere to the principles set out in the UN Convention.
Yes, and I'm trying to get you to understand one single thing, which is the possibility that even somebody who is given asylum, it's not necessarily the case that the more the better. It might be in individual cases and in general a case of the more the worse. And there would be so much more gained if that was acknowledged.
As I say, there will indeed be some who, of course, don't contribute as much as others. But I'm saying the majority...
But in general, you think the more the better.
The majority, the vast majority, will contribute and will go on to make an important contribution, to play by their rules, to pay their taxes, and to be proud to call themselves Britons.
And with that,
this is a presumption, but it's not backed up by the evidence.
And with that, we are going to have to leave that there now. Thank you, Enver. Thank you, Douglas.